Ja. Okay, so herzlich willkommen. Welcome to our today's meeting, to the start of our, well, actually tomorrow's conference and workshop, but we're starting today with a talk by Alexander Bikbov, who actually, well, it's hard to introduce him because most of you know him already. He's, well, a frequent guest at the Ruhr-University. But nevertheless, for those of you who yet do not know him, just a few words about Alexander, about his research fields and spheres of interest. He is currently an invited professor at École des Hautes Études and Sociales in Paris. He is an associate fellow in the Maurice Halbwachs Research Center there. And he is also very active as a scientific coordinator of independent research initiative, the so-called NII Meetingov, to put it in Russian, which is a mixed group studying mass street protests in Russia since December 2011. And with that being said, we already have one of his major fields of interests and fields of research, which is Russian counterculture, Russian protest movement. But Alexander is also very active as an editor and translator into Russian of various publications by French classics like Bourdieu, Foucault, but also he is a translator of contemporary French sociologists. I think we should also mention his book, Glamour of Order, published 2014, which is probably now about to become a classical study already, I suppose. There are books which are like wine, which are getting better with time. This book is a historical sociology of the concepts that change our reality. That is a very beautiful undertitle, I guess. And here in Bochum, Alexander is a visiting international professor, fellowship of the Research School of RUP. Yes, he is also a big friend of Slavic department of Lotman-Institut for Russian culture, and we are always happy to see you here. With your fields of interest being already mentioned, I guess I do not need to tell much about the topic of your today's presentation. So I just give the word to you. The floor is yours. Thank you very much. And
thank you, Alexander. Thank you, and good evening. I brought today the topic which prolongates the study I conducted in Russian field since 2011, which is the field of protest movements, of the civic movements, having quite little with social justice claims and issues of social solidarity. So when the events started in France, the yellow vests came to the streets, it was quite a disorder for intellectuals to interpret what is happening, why these people who didn't belong to political parties, to trade unions, to any politically oriented associations could act together, could deny the opposition between left and right, could mix in some way some topics which were presented by the extreme left and far right politicians on the public scene, together with some original contributions to the public agenda. And one of the interesting effects, one of the paradoxical effects, which comes as from my experience as a researcher of Russian protest and some collateral cases, like for example in Ukraine, in Poland, in some way in Brazil. I didn't study them personally, but these protests were mediated by other colleagues who studied them quite closely, is the fact that the paradoxical, the unusual French protest is quite usual and in some way normal, as for the global periphery, like Russian society, like Brazil society, Ukrainian society, some other societies, which survive quite an extensive and aggressive wave of neoliberal reforms, sweeping out political distinctions and traditional political institutions. So, in some extent, France, in the November of 2018, knew kind of Russification, if I may put it like that. Some structural institutional effects, some results of the public policies, some results of the reform of the social sector brought today an unedited movement which have some similarities, not all, but some similarities with the movements which struck the global periphery starting from 2010. So one of the points which I would like to clear out today is the place of violence in these kind of movements. Violence understood in a broader sense, not only physical corporal violence brought by the participants, but also the destruction of the urban infrastructure, also some interventions and clearly destructive interventions into national or local economy. Briefly, some how to say it, negative action brought by the participants, clearly conscious and constructed strategically or not, but still making part of the protest repertory. As I said, Russian movement, which was quite neutral, quite insensible to the issues of social justice and social solidarity, was also the movement quite distant from the use of violence, and I will explain or develop this further, while the images we have from the French Yellow Vests movement is the pure contrary to what we know or we could have from a distant view coming from the Russian society. The general image which is associated with the Yellow Vests movement is a burnt car, or maybe a broken window, something like that. So, in some extent, one of the questions which is global for this kind of understanding, for this kind of research, is if we really may admit we make some assumptions about the movements without getting closer to the field, without getting closer to making interviews and direct observations, in order to appreciate the role of one of the key elements of the social uprise and protest movement, such as violence. Another question consists in the mentioned one already, why and how some social movements and civic movements come to put today the topics of social justice, while some others do not. When we look at a distance on movements, when we study them through the screen of a computer, or to get it closer to reality, through the papers and media's reporting about the protest, we quite often lose important dimensions and important social variables which construct and which structure these movements. So, in some extent, one of the questions, so what's the place of social justice connected or disconnected to the topics of violence? But the second question, which is inevitable, if we take it as a research topic, if we take it as a field of our investigation, of scholar investigation, is the role of media and mediation more generally in the construction of our preformed or predefined interest and knowledge about what is happening at a distance. And finally, the third question, which I consider very important, is the question about the repertory of protest action. It's a widely discussed question, mostly in terms of violent or non-violent movement, tactics and creative strategies, etc. But what if we focus more on the topic of violence and destruction in order to understand it as a field where some distinctions and repertory nuances is possible, could be possible, in terms of if we try to distinct, or if we try to classify the types of violence according to their connection to the topics of social justice, to the topics of biographical or professional experiences, in order to explain the logic of violence, or if we put it in a more correct way, the logics of violence used or not used by particular movements. So, three main topics which I'd like to expose. In order to introduce to the Russian movement, I think most of you already know it's quite a dated topic. The protests in Russia, in large Russian cities, started in 2011, at the end of in December of 2011, and brought a generally very peaceful nature, so that even in the photos taken during the manifestations in most parts and most points and most events of the sequence, which continues until today, we may see that the corporal positions, the attention focus, the movement of the persons who are present in the protest spaces is quite peaceful, is quite immobilized in some way. There is quite little of movement in terms of troubling the established way of living in the city space. As you see, the categories of the protesters vary quite considerably. Should I just make it a bit larger? It's okay? No, but as for, is it okay for, yeah? Okay, so I wouldn't change it too much. Some of the elements of this field visuality of the protest movement brings to our attention also the fact that there are quite the representation of the protest is made also by people who look quite wealthy. Not all of them, but still this is not a classical social protest in terms of departure from the economic inequalities or the lack of provision, etc. And accordingly, some elements of this protest agenda were quite impressively influenced by the discourses which could be heard in the interviews on place, but also with some public performance presenting the protest as the protest for the best, not the protest coming from some negative points and, for example, and especially of social injustice and inequalities, but the claim coming from the claim to optimize institutions which don't work. So, one of the most impressive feature of this protest in Russian large cities, and this is a scene from one of the first rallies in December 2011, was the fact that the self-discipline of the protest was so high that the first rallies were not at all accompanied inside with the presence of the police. The police was all over around the protest places, but in the space itself of the protest, the police was not present. So, one of the main points which was highly supported by the participants was to prevent the degradation and violence, any so-called provocation coming from infused or infiltrated elements, that even if some signs, some pulsions of this so-called provocation bringing to violence was noticed in the space of the rally, the manifestants themselves were in function to operate it, to block it, and to bring the so-called provocators to the hands of police. So in many extents, the self-censorship and the self-discipline against violence in Moscow and in other large cities was so important for the protesters that they played the role of the police themselves. So this is one of the really rarest cases when a person who broke the press card of a journalist is first handed by the Protestants themselves, and then one policeman is called from the periphery of the rally in order to bring him to the police headquarters. As you see, this kind of peaceful attitude is and was, especially at the beginning of the rallies, so important that the front line between the risky and calm spaces was not detected easily by the participants, and this kind of protest selfie just in front of the line of a riot police ready to attack was not such a rare case before the 6th May 2012 when the police provoked quite an important collision with the manifestants, and this collision gave place to the so-called Bolotny case, when 30 persons participating in this manifestation, participating or not, in any case, it's a complex case in judicial and justice terms, were arrested following a kind of social or social professional sampling. One pensioner, one student, one person from the far right, one person from the far left, one liberal, one apolitical, etc., in order to represent different factions of the protest movement and to intimidate people to turn back to the streets. That didn't work in proper terms. The started repressions were, on the contrary, one of the triggers which brought new people to the streets in order to support the arrested ones. But in general terms, it was quite an important way to, how to say it in a correct way, to manage the protest through the police violence. And this is also an important element which is largely ignored, or was ignored until now, in the studies of the protest, because police, the tactics of police, the rationality of police action, and the instrumentality of police violence is quite a closed field for a researcher. It's almost impossible to get an access to the police in the action, in the moment of its application of that or another strategy towards the manifestants and towards the protest movement. So, in some extent, the only way to see how the police works and how the police action structures the protest movement is to observe it in action and to conclude, or to share with the participants some observations about the logic behind the police action. So, in general, in Russian case, as well as the manifestants, the protest movement was self-detained, self-disciplined, and not at all wishing to break the idea of a non-violent and civilized protest. The police was almost in many cases, in most part of the cases, was staying at the periphery of the protest action, so holding quite a fragile but still very sustainable front line between the manifestants and the violent regulation of the protest. So if we shift our view from Moscow, from other large Russian cities, to Paris today, starting from November 2018, and to not large, not so large French cities. What we observe from a distance, and this is the general idea which gives start of reflection about the protest movement, is the media images diffused quite largely about what is happening in Paris. And I think I just got several pictures coming from the French media to check in some way if you have the same image of the yellow vest movements in yellow vests movement in France, if it corresponds to your idea of what is happening in French streets during the last months. So some images which make an issue about the destruction, the destructive movement, the non-organized irrational movement, or on the contrary, of the infiltration of some organized elements which bring this destruction to the French public order, to the cities, etc. And it's quite regular, the image of burning objects, of beaten policemen, of broken houses, etc., corresponding to the image of the yellow vest, irresponsible, irrational, in some way childish, and in the same time quite outraged and violent crowd, which emerges every Saturday in the Paris streets, in the streets of other cities, and then disperses itself in some miraculous way. I don't know if in Germany the media stream corresponds to this French one. I presume that there might be quite interesting shifts which I'd like to question about. If you just may give me a short feedback, that would be quite interesting if these images are the same that characterize in Germany the yellow vests in France. Is it? Yes, yeah. Okay. Thank you. I would also add quite an interesting dimension of this work, because, for example, Spanish media are not that critical, as far as I understood, to the movement. There are also some other channels, international channels, or foreign channels on French territory, which try to give another vision of the protest movement, and especially, which is quite largely shared by the Yellow Vests themselves. This is the Russian TV channel Russia Today. Not because it gives a specially well-structured and ideologically compatible image of the movement, but on the contrary, because the strategy, the niche strategy of this TV channel corresponds perfectly well to the idea of the brute, of the raw reportage from the place of the action. So the small teams of Russia Today come to the actions, and they just make 5 hours or 2-hour videos without any comments, or giving from time to time voice to the participants of the movement. This is exactly what the French media never did from the very beginning of the protest. And in some extent, the position of the French media corresponds to the position of the Russian media, of some of the Russian media, against Russian protest movement, which were reflecting the pro-state or pro-governmental vision of the protest, as manipulated, as not knowing well what is going on and what is going for. There are some similarities in the mainstream media coverage of both protests, even if the nature of both protests is different. So the self-production of the Yellow Vests relies mostly on the fact that they avoid the most sensational topics like burned cars, but giving much to the speech of the actors at place in the large cities during the rallies and in small points and provincial geographical points during the occupations in order to give sense to the protests. And Russia today, paradoxically, enters well in this logic, not because, once again, its service is very well structured. So, the Russian media, for those of you who speak in Russian, just in order to have a short glance, are mostly negative to the protest of the Yellow Vests. And what is quite astonishing, these are those media, not all, but some of them, the key ones, the so-called liberal ones, are the media which supported the Russian protest of 2011-2012, like Kommersant, BBC, RBK, Независимая газета, etc. So, in some extent, we see a reversal of the appreciations of the protest movement, and I hope we'll have a chance to discuss it further. Some neutral coverage is given by the channels which do not belong to the liberal sector, but mostly to the pro-governmental sector. And also, there are some favorable and very favorable coverage by Russian media who approach to the pole of the pro-Kremlin media. So, in some extent, we observe quite a paradoxical situation. If we try to reconstruct the own production, the own logic, the own rationality of the Yellow Vest movement, and then we try to refer or to report the results to the media, quite probably the media which could be interested in a sociological, neutral interpretation of the movement would be the pro-Kremlin ones. And this is not very reassuring for sure, but this is also quite interesting from the point of view of the structuring of the movement, not only from the point of view of the actors themselves, and not only from the point of view of the police, which remains quite a non-transparent agency, bringing quite much to the way the movement acts, but also to the way the movement senses, it feels itself about what is happening during the weeks and the months of the protest. Another important agency which structures the movement, this is the media, and during the interviews in Moscow in the protest of 2011, which started in 2011 and which is continuing up today, but also during the interviews with the Yellow Vests, I could note an special importance which is given by the actors to the mediatic coverage of the movement and to the nuances, to the way, to the modes of speaking about the force of the movement, its representativity, social representativity, but also about its rationality. So, as far as the French mainstream media talks really badly, really negatively about the movement, one of the points of high criticism and rejection of the Yellow Vests presents itself quite rational in this context. When you read that Yellow Vests attacked some journalists, Yellow Vests prohibited some journalists to cover their actions, that doesn't mean that they are irrationally irritated by the presence of the media, but on the contrary, they read quite attentively what media speak, what media say about the actions, and they try to control rationally and strategically. They try to control their image produced by the large mainstream media about the actions. Still, there is quite an interesting point. Making interviews in the field of the protest, making interviews in the moment itself of the protest actions, I also bring the camera with me, and from time to time, when there is a moment of transition from one interview to another, I take the camera out of the pocket and I make some shots. And trying to analyze the results of this practice, even if I'm not a professional and consecutive and how to say, systematic photographer of the protest action, I give privilege to interviews and not to the shots. I should mention that looking back at my own results of the practice, I noted that finally, if I wish to send some images to my colleagues and friends in order to explain what is happening in the streets without words, the results of this photo practice wouldn't be very much different from the media image. For another reason, not because I am very critical or negative to the yellow vests, but just because the camera clicks at the moments and looking the places and the spots of the urban structure where the order is broken in a more spectacular manner. So I'd like to present you some of these shots taken in the streets during the interviews or in the interval, in the pause in between the interviews, in order to give an idea of the fact that, once again, the visual logics covering the protest doesn't really leave much of the choice in terms of the so-called interesting topics or of the topics which could be revealed if we wish to speak about what is happening in the streets in short terms. So this is one of the first rallies in December 2018 where you may observe some results of the collisions between the police and the manifestants. And if you see, not at this shot, if you see the police is very actively present in the space of the rally, of the street action. The gas is very sensible in the streets, affecting the whole districts of the city, and it should be mentioned that these are the places which the French and Parisian bourgeoisie lives. So these are not just suburbs which are accustomed to police operations. These are places where people are accustomed to comfort of life and of everyday consumption. And once again, some images coming from this experience, quick images, images just destined to fix the state of the protest space, reflect the most sensational changes in the routine order. For example, people who wandered during the collisions with the police. Yeah, this is a strange thing. These are some joggers who still make their morning practice, in spite of the gas feeling in the streets. But it's quite rare. Or, for example, some people just reversing the cars and trying the prohibited things, the things which they never tried, they were never admitted to in their ordinary urban life. Or this kind of Arc de Triomphe shot, which is completely immobilized. All the cars are just banished, and instead of the normal traffic, very dense, intensive traffic, which is developing around this arc, we see people moving in all the directions. So it's true that, in some extent, the results of this self-reflection about what we grasp in the protest comes quite easily in terms with the mediatic ideas of the burned city, of the distracted districts, and of the extreme violence coming from the movement. So, is there a logic behind this destruction? Either is a logic which is anticipated by the participants themselves, and in which way it may serve the explanation of a major change, a major shift in the French society, and not only in French society, but in protest movements of the last decade, which now comes up to France. This is the question which I would like to consider in the next part of my speech, but first I'd like to leave you some space for questions and remarks, just in order to restore the dialogue and our feedback. Just behind you. Would you like to take the mic?
I don't think so. Yeah? Should I? It's recorded.
Then you have to. So just come here.
All right. Thanks. Thanks for this great talk. I'm looking forward to the next part already. Just a quick commentary on your very interesting observation, I think. My name is Jan, by the way. Sorry for not introducing myself. So the very interesting observation that the pro-Kremlin media report very positively, or at least neutrally, on the Yellow Vest movement. I personally don't find that so surprising, to be honest. I mean, I think the political opponents just align, right? They are against Macron. In a very crude geopolitical way of thinking, you would also think that Kremlin mainstream policy would want somebody like Macron, who of course represents everything that Putin and the movements in Western Europe are up against. So liberalism, international liberalism, and all of that. I don't really see it very surprising that this aligns, but it's still an interesting observation, right? I have another question, but I think I want to pass the microphone on to somebody else.
If you want. Thank you. You also had a question. No,
yeah,
thank you for the comment.
You need to take the microphone. Because we are recording.
Thank you for your comment. It's true that in some extent this is the logic of the political alliance and opposition, but it's still quite interesting to understand how the interference of, say, anti-Macron or some other anti-positions make part of the whole media projects. And I would say that as long as it makes part of a larger political game, it also affects the populations which were not destined to be the receptor of this, at least at first, at the beginning, of this mediatic message. So it's quite a dynamics which could be observed. The success of the channels like Russia Today, the growing success, started from the, I would say, mostly far-left factions of the European societies, which were receiving Russia Today as an alternative possibility to the mainstream Western media, now is extended to quite a larger population, which was not interested, for example, in the political issues, in the mediatical coverage of the political issues. And these are the protest movements which give legitimacy and force to such projects.
Any further questions? So you need to come here. I'm sorry. It's all due to YouTube.
That's fine. Yeah, I think I disagree a bit about Russia Today in the West as covering left-wing coverage, because in Britain, where there's like a channel of Russia Today that is just for Britain, particularly they take interviews and experts on all kinds of issues who are well-known anti-Semites, fascists. The left have a certain amount in this niche strategy of giving people coverage that wouldn't get on the BBC or other television, but I think that's much more politically comes from the far right. But I think what is interesting between both protests, you compared Moscow and Paris now is the role of the police and the role of the protesters' attitude to the police. If you say the protesters in Moscow, I think it's probably quite a reasonable analogy, were like the bourgeoisie, the upper middle class, quite well off, and they obviously have some kind of, maybe they have this kind of typical respect for the police, maybe they don't see them as quite as much as part of the state, and then giving protesters they don't like, giving them to the police to arrest. Whereas in Paris, you say the police were very present, but if you look on most of these photographs, you don't see any police. At the Arc de Triomphe, there was a case where there were many police wearing yellow vests, being agents provocateurs, and I happened to be caught up in one of these. I was in Paris by chance, planned for a long time, and happened to be caught up in one of the major demonstrations, and the fact was there were no police visible anywhere. The police tactic on one of those occasions was clearly to allow people, whether they were police or not, you'll never know, to smash stuff up. And like if you've been on demonstrations in Berlin or in England as well, it was clear there were no police anywhere. The situation was incredibly chaotic. All the police were protecting Galerie Lafayette and encouraging people very slowly to walk into this direction, herding people into an underground station, then telling people the underground station was closed and forcing people to leave. And outside that, police in riot gear smashing their truncheons against. So it like, if you've seen this is very a tactic to cause people to be worried, and at the same time, I think the point is that when I was there, French television did provide a quite detailed, on a certain level, academic, ideological debate with what the protesters wanted. You had people discussing, like, my French isn't that good, but I can understand political English and political German. A lot of the words are quite similar, and you had people on a very intellectual level of discussion about what different types of protesters want, and not just a few random people that Russia Today or someone with a flag on a demonstration interview. You had people talking about the various manifestos, the various demands, and I think it's not quite as simple. So I would disagree with a number of things you said, but it's a good comparison to make.
Thank you. First of all, it's more complex, as you say, but also for the Russian protest, not at all the protesters were composed only of high bourgeoisie in Moscow case, in the case of Moscow protest, and not at all Moscow bourgeoisie and the Muscovites in general have a special respect for the police. So the relationship with the police is quite tense and quite ambiguous. So that the main point of the protest movement, which was prepared beforehand, and that was one of the lines to which the protest was tried to hold on during throughout the whole series of the events, is we should be more civilized than the authorities, and if we accept some degradation, it means that we give them a chance to attack us. So, for sure, that was not a respect, but mostly a fear to be attacked, which was quite an important disciplinary factor of the Russian protest. And the fact that a part of the protesters belonged to the wealthy stratas of the Muscovite population was only confirming or in some way maintaining this logic. It's easier to be well disciplined in front of police when your monthly income comes up to $5,000 per month, right? So from that point of view, the French protesters started with quite an interesting ambiguity, them too, who had much more respect to the national police than the Muscovites in the protest movement. In my first interviews in the beginning of December, one of the very clear parameters of this respect was reflected on semantic level when people were talking about our police who should join us at one point. And the expectation of the fact that the police comes to the ranks and comes to join the ranks of the protesters is still remaining among the interviewed. So, in many respects, the non-respect on the quite a critical attitude of the Muscovites towards the police was one of the factors to discipline themselves, not to allow the police to attack. And on the contrary, one of the factors which pushed the Yellow Vests to act against the police was the fact that police didn't reveal the level, didn't correspond to the level of the high expectations the protesters were bringing at the beginning of the actions. And as for Russia today, once again, it's also a complex project. I'm not at all. I'm trying to justify it politically. I'm quite aware, and I'm critical and publicly critical about the way it functions. But the success of the niche they took especially in France, actually, I'm not sure about Germany, but in France it's for sure, corresponds to what I could observe in Italian and French far-left milieus already in 2012, 2015, when more and more left activists were watching Russia Today, were reading Sputnik, just because they were quite interested, quite eagerly seeking for the alternative information, alternative to the mainstream media. And one of the tactics of these media is to offer a part of the stream which is not contaminated with anti-Semitism or some far-right ideology. This is the trick they use quite successfully, and this is also the way how the Yellow Vests perceive them. I was quite attentive to this dimension. I was quite also polemic. I was quitting my role of a sociologist researcher in front of this attitude towards Russia Today, and I was opposing myself to the idea that this is a honest honest media. So they are quite selective in their consumption of this channel, saying that they mostly watch the videos which are devoted to Yellow Vests. So this is quite an interesting tactics to take the most important for the movement, but it's also true that it doesn't prevent the infiltration or infusion of the ideas of the sympathies to Russia and especially to Vladimir Putin, which comes connected, which comes chained to this so-called brute or raw reportage. So it's quite an interesting and complex question. I think we'll have many occasions in the nearest future, in the nearest 2-3 years, to examine better how this connection and contamination proceeds.
Stefan Hesbruggen, Moscow. Just a very quick follow-up question, because I find this very interesting. There's some feedback, sorry. What are your suspicions or hypotheses with regard to the thesis that in the beginning French protesters understood police and therefore the Republic, represented by the police, as something that should be on their side? If you compare this to protests, say, in the banlieues in the 90s or 2000s, none of the Arab youth standing on the street would have expected the police to be on their side. And secondary question to that, what about the cultural/ethnic composition of the protesters you talked to, expressing this expectation?
Thank you. You anticipated one of the points I'd like to touch. No, it's okay. It's a good introduction. This is one of the cases in both protests. I mean, in Russian protest and in French protest, the core social composition of the movement are white working population of both genders. More of male gender at the beginning of the actions, or in the actions which were considered as risky after the first collisions with the police, but then quite an egalization of the gender constitution, and especially some collisions, maybe not real collisions, but still some conflicts in the beginning, which were establishing between working people and the unemployment ones. So there were some cases when the working yellow vests were chasing unemployment people from the protest spaces, as well as the Moscow and St. Petersburg protesters were chasing the homeless people from the protest movement, from the protest spaces. So there is quite a social censorship which acts in different sense, not in sense of just pure racism, but like in Moscow, social racism, but in terms of social representation of the protest. First of all, yellow vests were considering themselves, I mean the core movement, the beginning, which was constituted through several petitions, through several symbolic videos, was the idea that this is the working France which uprises. And one of the points of the reference points of the movement at the beginning was that the world of the working population is managed by the government in an extremely bad manner, starting from the reform of the working code in 2016, but then going back to the reform, the falsified or not respected vote of the French population for the European Constitution in 2005, then again deeper to the introduction of euro, which degraded the consumer power of the French population, etc. There are several factors which are considered, which are mentioned in the interviews by the participants of the movement, which constitute an idea and which makes still a reference to the idea that this is the protest of the working population, which has quite an important element of the working pride. These are not people who just make profit of the social system. These are people who are proud to contribute into national wealth, and this is one of the reasons they attack, they may criticize, or they could criticize at the very beginning spontaneously, people who don't work, or people living in the suburbs, etc., etc. Further on, with the development of the movement, with quite an important saturation of the internal debate within the movement, and each manifestation, each rally in Paris is a real communicative place, not only a place of action, but also a place of self-pedagogy, of self-didacticism in political issues and in social matters. So it was in some way overcame, so that today's discourse, typical discourse of the regular participants of the movement, is that, yeah, at the beginning we were a bit stupid, we were trying to oppose ourselves to black people or to unemployed people, etc. But now we understand that these are capitalists who try to make us quarrel. This is one point. So this is important to understand that the spontaneous social antagonism coming up to racism, social racism, was overcame, at least in a large part, within the movement. And the second is the fact that, finally, coming closer to your question, about the opposition or the transfer of the experience from the suburbs to the center of the city, it is especially true that the working population coming or living in terms with the institutions of French Republic and believing from the school that if they are conformed to the Republican values, they will live good, this fundamental belief was broken. And this is also something which is reported quite largely in the interviews, which I gather in the protest spaces. The idea that our police may attack us even if we do not make anything criminal, the idea that our government may punish us even if we work well, this is the fundamental point of the protest sensibility of the Yellow Vests, which was completely absent in the Moscow, in Russian protest, from the side of the from the part of the participants who were also working, but who interiorized since many years the, how to say it, the flexibility of the norm and the lack of the Republican values which were reigning and still reigning the institutional sphere in Russia. So in many cases, the idea of the Russian protesters was like, we are against the bribes, the corruption of the medical services, of the economical control, of the police, etc. We would like that it starts working well. Finally, it starts working. But there was not an idea that these people who represent the medical control, the police, the corrupted justice, etc., are our people. While in France, this integrational belief was really high, and it's true that in some discussions which took place between the white working Yellow Vests and black or color non-working inhabitants of the suburbs, this idea that the suburbs knew already everything which Yellow Vests just getting on their on their skin during the last 15 years was one of the crucial ideas, one of the crucial points of discussion, but also of disaccord, of quarrel, if you wish. So it's also something which is quite largely, maybe not largely, but quite intensely discussed in the points of meeting organized from both sides by the associations working in the suburbs and by some left, mostly left-oriented Yellow Vests who actively participate in the movement. So I would say that it's another point of conversion which might not work, but which is still in the phase of test and active construction.
I suppose we are already in the second part of your talk, but if there are any questions to the first one, now or never. I do have one, right? And I want to come back to the violence issue. I'll have quite a simple question. In Russian case, at least, we have a few very vocal opponents of violence, right? So the supposed headliners of the protest were very vocal about saying that violence is an illegitimate tool of protest, right? And although this protest was not institutionalized in any way, these people were very authoritative, right? Do we have such voices in French case, where some, I don't know, intellectuals, singers, chess players, writers, whatever, well, go to the public, well, saying that violence should be prohibited from?
Thank you. This is one of the core questions I mentioned in a short form at the beginning of the talk. How the constitutive violence, how the civic destruction is legalized or legitimized within the movement which declares itself not only apolitical but also non-violent. We may observe several cases of protests in all around the world, starting from 2010, when the movement declares itself non-violent and tries to hold on the line of non-violent and describes itself and reflects itself and planifies itself as a non-violent movement. Still, the non-violence in several cases might be understood like a possibility to reply with a legitimate defense to the police or to some institutional violence or aggression applied to the legitimate protest agenda or protest agency of the participants and their initiatives. So from that point of view, for example, the non-violence was the major part of the definition of the movements, not only in Russia, but also in Ukraine during Maidan, but also in Brazil in 2013, 2016, during the protests against the the growing transport fares, then against the destruction of public schools, and finally in the globalized movement. The non-violence was also, this could sound quite paradoxical, but it was also a very important part of the agenda of the Greek protest movement in 2010, which accepted quite consciously, at least the far left part, the anarchist part of the faction of the mobilization, accepted violent action as a constitutive tool of direct democracy. So, in many cases, we have to deal with with something which doesn't have another definitions than non-violence. But what is most interesting is how the violence finally gets compatible to the non-violent definition or non-violent framework of all these movements. And from that point of view, I would say that we should seek for some rationality of the violence in order to understand in which way it is compatible. I mean by this the following thing. If we consider that there is just a contradiction in the movement, that the movement doesn't control itself very well, as, for example, the Russian movement controlled itself, and there are some incongruency in the way to conduct, we come closer to a kind of naturalist vision of the society, of the crowd, of the 19th century, coming to an idea that as long as well-controlled and controlling themselves well individuals, rational individuals, male, in most cases, individuals, come into crowd, they become irrational, uncontrollable, and completely emotional. So this is the idea which was quite largely propagated in the 19th century, and don't mention only Gabriel Tarde and some other theoreticians of the crowd. But what we should really seek sociologically and anthropologically is not the contradiction, but the logic which makes possible the understanding of this violence and of destruction as an integral part of the non-violence in terms of legitimate civic action. And from one point of view, what may explain us, what may help to explain us this compatibility, this logical integration, is are the social or biographical characteristics of the participants of the agency of the protest. And from another part, we may seek to understand it in the repertory of, for example, working movement or far-left movement, which is historically anchored much better in European societies than in the Russian society, on some other societies which were more disciplined in front of the possibility going violent. So, replying to one part of your question, I would say that the confusion of the French intellectuals in front of the Yellow Vests was double, not only because it was unexplainable in terms of the existing institutional structure, how an apolitical person or crowd may act so politically, but also by the fact that most part of the French intellectuals came through the experience of the 60s and 70s, highly politicized, which were marked by the ideology of violence. Not overtly, not always publicly accepted, but still an important part of the socialization of the current generation of the intellectuals is the question of violence. And if today some intellectuals claim to prohibit violence, they don't do it in France. They don't do it in the same way as the Russian chess players or writers appeal to some moral values, etc. They speak mostly about the non-acceptable instruments or non-acceptable uses of violence which could be in some way used differently. So it's quite a different modality of speaking about violence, but I would say that many of the intellectuals just took distance from the movement, and that gave, in some extent, a free space of self-interpretations which were produced by the participants themselves. Not always publicly, but still. So, once again, about this rationality. If in Russian case, the rationality of non-violence and the coherence of the non-violent action, which was excluding really hardly any kind of destruction and of physical aggression, was produced by the participants who were not necessarily very well paid or were not inheritors of large fortunes, but were mostly and especially highly educated. In different sources, including my research and research with my younger colleagues we conducted, one of the most undiscussable parameter of the protest in Russia is the fact that 2/3 up to three-fourths of the participants of the protest actions were holders of university diplomas or were making higher studies, university studies, at the moment of the protest. This overcomes all the proportions of the highly educated population in Moscow, in Russia in general. But what is especially important that in the interviews many people were reporting about the value of the university education for them, and this parameter, this variable, was quite corresponding in quite an important correspondence to the idea that finally we should claim to fix the institutions other than to destroy them. The social constitution of the Yellow Vest movement is different and considerably different. It's not the population of the banlieue. These are not mostly people who have some social assistance from the government, but they belong mostly either to the lowest scale, the lowest part of the scale in the public sector. So they're, for example, nurses, small employees in the public local structures. They may work as intermittent functionaries employed for particular projects, etc. School teachers and the staff which fulfills the intermediate operations, intermediate type of job in the public institutions, or people who belong to the lower part of the corporate sector, of private sector, in large corporations, or to the small artisanat, small keep shoppers, small producers, small independent producers, etc., in the private sector. So in many cases, this is the working population considered as the core of the working class in terms of the 19th century, the one which was quite clearly opposed to the dangerous class. These are people who didn't participate in some suspicious activity, who were quite conservatively functioning in their job places, and still who were not formed by the university structures, by university institutions, who were not formed in order to perform intellectual functions in the current Republican structure. And this is something which gives them a more important point of reference for the violent action, in some extent, because some, or a part of these people who participate in the destruction or who accept the destruction without participating personally in the breaking shops or destroying banks, the case which may explain this acceptance consists in the fact that they perform the functions as a part of this state apparatus against which they revolt themselves. So people who work, for example, in employment agency, people who get in touch with even poorer populations in their local communes, people who observe the difficulties of their neighbors, come into difficulty to get to the next month with their small wages, is something which reflects quite dramatically the changing institutional management of French social sector. We are quite accustomed to an idea that France remains a socialist society in the way to manage social sector and public sector. But what is happening in the last years, and this is also quite largely reported in the interviews collected in the protest actions, the fact that it degraded so considerably in the last years that, for example, I may give you one case or two, three cases just in order to illustrate that, for example, a nurse who works the whole week gets 1,200 euros as her regular monthly wage, and she has 2 children which she has to feed. So she works in a public hospital, and she's prohibited as a public functionary to get side jobs. Officially, if her side jobs are discovered, she would be banned from the public function. So she has quite a choice to cope with this prohibition, with this interdiction, either to get illegal jobs, and for example, one of the interviewees confessed that she has 2 other side jobs, or try to accumulate supplementary hours of work out of frame of 35 legal working week in France. But if she collects these supplementary hours, she couldn't monetize them. So she couldn't have more than 1,200 euros she has monthly. She only may use these supplementary hours as accumulated day off. But she doesn't decide herself which day off she takes. If she needs to go to care for her children, she can't just take Wednesday or Friday when she needs it. This is her boss at the hospital who decides the day she may have day off. So when you accumulate this data about the lifestyle of the persons who protest, you start to understand better the way, the modality of the protest of the people who exercise the function of the state and who uprise themselves against what they call dictatorship of the state within the professional field or within the field of the living experience. But what is important in this context is just the fact that there are several modalities, and I'm coming to the question of the repertory of the violent action, the several modalities of making violence possible within the framework of a protest, of a rally, for example, in a large city, in the center of the large city like Paris, or in the point occupied by the protesters, like the round points in the roads, in large roads of France, or in some strategic economical points, like, for example, the petroleum refineries, which are occupied by some of the participants. So, one of the modality of the violence which is largely accepted by the participants who declare themselves non-violent is the modality of immediate reply to the police violence. Immediate reply to for example, seeking your body just when you enter to the space of the protest. For the Russian case, it became quite regular practice. The metal detectors and seeking your backpacks and your pockets since the early 2000s, an integral part of any activity connected to the street or public protest. In France, that didn't exist before 2016. The first transfer of this, once again, Russified technologies happened in 2016 during the protests against the reform of the travel code. Of the working code, of the labor code. Since then, it is regularly used in the public space of the large French cities, and if the regular activists are experimenting that with quite an acceptance of the games of the rule of the game, the newcomers, the new populations, come in with the idea that the institutions belong to us, that we are loyal and the institutions should reply respectively, that France is the capital of the French people, are just shocked and immediately revolted by these practices of disrespect of the right to manifest. This is one of the most easily detectable reasons why people, for example, start burning the trash bins or breaking some small objects in the street. Another type of the violence which is closely connected to this tactic, to this reply, is a deferred reply to the police violence. For example, in one of a large interview I had an opportunity to take with three young women participating in an occupation of a petroleum refinery not very far from Paris, in 60 kilometers from Paris, consisted in the fact that they were occupying this refinery during several weeks until the police came to push them out from the occupation. So during the dialogue, during the trade which was installed between them and the policemen didn't have, at least following the testimony of these young persons, police didn't wish first to apply force in a strict manner. They were trying to convince the occupants to leave the place. But the occupants were convinced that they have the right to occupy the place. So at one moment the police received an order to use the gas and the sticks in order to push out the occupiers. That happened just on the eve of a large rally in Paris. So even if these particular persons, these three young women, didn't participate in violent acts, they were observing them at a distance, they were quite positive, they were quite solidary with the destruction caused to some large shops, some shops of grand marks, because they were saying yesterday the police applied to us the violence, so today we need to reply. In some extent, the idea that the violence, the institutional violence, should be rewarded in the same currency is something which circulates, maybe not that largely, but circulates among the protesters, getting socialized under this police and institutional pressure. What happens next, not next, but by the side of this experience-founded violence, is the communicative function of the violence. And this is extremely important in the case of the Yellow Vest manifestations. When I was interviewing several people, in act of destruction. For example, there was a young man who was just breaking down a parkometer. When I asked him to explain why he destructs the parkometer and not another object, he was quite clear in his action and his rationality. He explained to me that first, this is the point of extraction and taxing. So the parkometers should be cut. Then he explained that he participated already, so he had some experience of political mobilization and socialization. He participated in other types of rallies beforehand, also in the rallies against the reform of the labor code. But he got an experience from all these participations of these involvements that nice rallies do not bring to results. They just didn't hear us. They didn't wish to hear what we say. So the unique way to make them hear and to make them see us is to break something. And since they started breaking, the government started reacting. So in a very interesting way, the same revendication, the same claim that the Moscow protest brought, or the Russian protest brought in 2011, 2012 to the streets of the large Russian cities was also, we don't need just everything be fixed in a moment. We need to be seen and we need to be heard. And also in Ukraine, finally, the initial phase of the protest was also connected to the claim of the visibility of this new commitment, of this newcomers to the political space or to the public space. They were not seen, and in many cases, the routinized and institutionalized manifestations and rallies in France are just largely ignored by the government within the framework of this routine when some trade unions or some political agencies come to protest, and the government just accelerates the course of the reform. This is what was seen by some of the participants who were the initiative agency to start the degradation of the public goods in order to communicate. I should say that today this is more or less generalized rationality of the Yellow Vests. If you interview them today and you ask them to explain the violence against the urban infrastructure, almost in every case, this mutualized evidence should be or would come out in the explanation, in the rationalization of the destruction. Before we started breaking things, they just didn't wish to hear us. And this is also one of the reasons why the Black Bloc is not totally, but largely accepted today by the Yellow Vests, under the reason that the Black Bloc permits to do something that we do not permit ourselves to do personally. So in some way, it's a kind of delegation of the function of civic violence, while at the beginning, the suspect and the opposition towards far left and far right, both, was quite high. And during the interviews, the Yellow Vests were reporting quite a distance, quite a negative impression of the presence of Black Bloc and some anti-fascists or some other professionalized activists in the protest space. Aside the communicative function of the violence, there is another one which is intimately connected with the history of the working movement in Europe, and which refers justly to the capacity of the workers to break the machine they contribute to. So if we look back to the history of working movement in coal industry, for example, we will find some quite spread tactics of breaking the equipment in order to push the employers to follow the agenda imposed by the by the workers. For example, to optimize the sanitary conditions or the security conditions in the mines. So what we observe in the yellow movement, yellow vest movement, corresponds quite well to this idea of the working population, which may use the working places or just the mastership of the economy at the local level in order to make the patrons, to make the bosses, to accept the revendications that they otherwise didn't wish to accept. So the main idea which stays behind this destruction, which is much more calculated, which is much more strategic, is to break the national economy. Not more, not less. The idea is the following. If we break the national economy, then Macron should be pushed out of his throne, not by us, but by the monopolies, by the capitalists who brought him to power. If we break the national economy, the first who would be touched by this violence, by this destruction, should be the great monopolies, the large monopolies, who now evade from taxing, who now profit from overpricing, who now do not participate in the social project and solidarity and social solidarity. So, if we manage to break the big storages of production, for example, of Amazon or of some industrials, if we block some large markets of stock commerce, if we break the traffic of goods in the truck driving of everyday practice, we may arrive quite quickly to the influence which we could not have making just public symbolic actions in the streets of the large cities. And this is an idea which brought some of the yellow vests to occupy the petroleum refinery or to occupy the places or the accesses bringing to commercial depot and commercial exchange centers, or to make some punctual and momentary actions targeting huge producers and commercial institutions. The same logic stays behind the breaking of the offices of large banks, of chain commercial shops, and some other agencies which participate in the destruction of the small producers or small consumers. In many cases, if we make the whole list of what was broken, of what was burnt, on what was attacked during the manifestations of the Yellow Vest, in most part, in the top of the list and in global majority of this list, we would find mostly the monopolies like Vinci or the luxury shops or huge banks, etc., which are quite rationally chosen and quite meditatively calculated as the target of this economical destruction. Finally, and I'm coming to the end of this list. This is also so it's communicative. It's communicative function of violence. It's calculated or strategic violence, and which is closely connected to this, the punishing of monopolies. But it's also some collateral violence which is accepted by the movement. What I mean under this category of collateral violence or collateral destruction, these are small shops, small cafes, restaurants which do not belong to chains and monopolies, or some cultural institutions like schools which might be targeted by the violence. So who exercises this violence? In many cases, this kind of violence, this kind of collateral destruction is banned, is opposed by the Yellow Vests. And some of them are clearly criticizing the fact that not only the large enterprises, but also small, suffer from the violence, from the destruction. But what is also important, some of them, especially having some activist socialization, accept that it makes part of the inevitable losses or inevitable reductions which happen during any movement. And they make quite a clear parallel with the action of police, which, for example, launches the grenades of the gas towards the crowds without making difference of who is acting more actively or who is just watching or passing by. And I admit that I tried to interview, they were not bold interviews, but just exchanges with the policemen, and it's true that the police acts in the same logic. When they try to justify why they launch so many grenades of gas or explosive grenades without making difference of the direction and without targeting particular persons in the crowd, they explain it in the same way. They say this is the logic of the collateral losses and of collateral injuries. Yes, the whole district may suffer from the gas, but this way we may suppress the most aggressive part of the protest, of the rally. So in some way there is a mirror logic of the police and of the professionalized activists who accept a part of the degradation as an inevitable collateral effect of the movement. But I also had an opportunity to interview a professional thief who came to the movement, to join the movement, in order to steal luxury watches from the shops placed in the center of the city, and he was quite clearly apolitical. He was quite clearly suspect about the political or the public objectives, the mission of the Yellow Vests. He was testing his own activities as a pure profitism, as a pure economical act, which is made possible by the disorientation of the forces and participants during the action. So, in many cases, aside these collateral effects and the presence of the professional thieves and robbers who accompany the movement and who profit collaterally from the movement, the large part of what is destructed, of what is injured, what is targeted by the destruction and the violence of the movement, is taken, is done in quite a rational and quite well calculated logic of the reply, of the reaction to the institutional infrastructural violence which is exercised in the working places, which is exercised in the small communities degrading economically and socially, which is exercised in the places of the protest, while police anticipates the violence coming from the grassroots and frames the movement with persecutions, gas, explosions, and corporal physical aggression. So I would like to stop here. I know that there are many sub-points and sub-dimensions which are revealed in these cases, and I hope we will develop it in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexander, for this great talk. I guess we need a couple of moments to gather our thoughts, and I would like to use a brief break in order to give you some information about the coming workshop tomorrow. So tomorrow we'll start at 2 p.m. in the Slavic department, and we are going to talk about Protestant counterculture in contemporary Russia and in brackets in Ukraine. So not about Paris this time, but all of you are very welcome there. I guess it is in our Sakharov room, right? It's okay. the program is here, so if you are interested in participating, in being with us tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, you are very welcome. And now, coming back to the Yellow Vest, violence, and maybe Russia for this part as well, your questions, remarks, critical thoughts, disagreements. Okay, Jan.
Yeah, thanks very much. I'm going to sit down. I fully understand that two of your three parts of your definition of violence, like the collateral and the communicative one. With the strategic one, I have a bit of a problem, because if you really, as a movement or as a part of a movement, if you really want to disrupt the functioning of a whole national economy, you have to do it more strategically, right? I mean, you cannot just break a few windows of shops that belong to monopolists. You have to either conduct general strike or something like that, or terrorist attacks that, for example, take out electricity networks or something like that. And for that, you would have to have an organizational structure that I don't think this movement has. So my question is this more of a post hoc rationalization maybe that they apply to their own actions rather than a real strategic movement on their part? And what is your thought about that?
Thank you. I would say that I mentioned as a hypothesis the recycling of the working class strategies of resistance at the working place, but we should understand that today some of the strategies, and it's for sure that some parents of the Yellow Vest were participating in these actions, is realized in a professional structure which is far from the organized working movement of the pre-war era. So I would say that these are some tactics which are used, which are employed in a highly changed condition, and your doubt is quite legitimate in this case. Could it work? Many of those who I requested about the efficiency of this kind of violence are divided about the final results. Some of them quit. So if it was much more massive in the beginning of the movement in the November, December, and finally the Yellow Vest movement didn't start from the Paris manifestations, Paris rallies. It started in the profound Provence, in the profound regional points of nowhere, in the round points of the traffic routes and autobahn, which were occupied in order to so-called filter, to stop for 5-15 minutes the traffic of the cars, and then it was moved forward to the occupation of some strategic points like the petroleum refineries in order to block the one of the reasons to raise the petroleum tax, the fuel tax. So it was calculated quite well at that moment, but then with several weeks of experience and after the police violence, the participants of several of some of this part of the participants of these initiatives realized that finally the injuries, the collateral injuries are higher, not to the monopolies but to the core citizens which function in the routine way and, for example, come late to work, etc. So some of them just quit, they preferred to change the tactic, and, for example, today some of them join the professional protest, coming in the truck driver profession, in the local communities, etc., etc. So they became mobile and detached from this idea of blocking the national economy punctually. Another part consists and persists on this topic, and here the communicative function of violence is indissociable, is inseparable from the strategic one. So turn back, or now today it's prohibited to turn back, for example, to the Champs-Élysées, to this central part of Paris with the luxury commerce, in order to break the commerce, to break the numbers of the weekend consumption or trade, but also to show once again that the vulnerability does not make part only of the style of the lifestyles of the small ones, but also of the big ones. So I would say that there is quite a developed rationality and balancing of different effects and possibilities to continue in the movement. But in any way, this is not for me to judge at which point that could be more effective or more efficiency than terrorist attacks.
Okay, quick glance on the clock tells me that we are running out of time. So unfortunately, I'm going to make a full stop here. But if there are any further questions or if there are some food for thought, we can continue our discussion in the Q-West in a more relaxed atmosphere. You are all welcome there. Thank you very much for being with us, and hopefully we see each other tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.